On the morning of July 1, 1946, a four-engine Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress lifted off from a coral runway on Eniwetok Atoll in the Marshall Islands. Its four Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines thundered at full power. Its propellers bit into the humid Pacific air. Its wings caught the morning sun. Everything about the takeoff looked perfectly normal except for one extraordinary detail. There was nobody on board. No pilot gripped the control column. No co-pilot scanned the instruments. No navigator plotted the course. No bombardier crouched over his sight. No gunners peered through plexiglass from the waist windows or the ball turret or the tail position. The cockpit was empty. The fuselage was empty. Every station in the aircraft was vacant, and this unmanned bomber was heading directly toward a nuclear explosion. 8 minutes earlier, a B-29 superfortress named Dave's Dream had released a 23-kiloton plutonium implosion bomb over Bikini Atoll, roughly 200 miles to the east. The weapon detonated 520 feet above the turquoise lagoon, vaporizing thousands of tons of seawater, irradiating a fleet of 95 target warships anchored below, and sending a mushroom cloud boiling upward past 35,000 feet. The flash was visible for 100 miles. The shockwave rippled the surface of the lagoon like a stone dropped in a pond. Now this unmanned flying fortress was boring straight into that churning radioactive column at 24,000 feet, its cockpit camera transmitting a ghostly black and white television picture to controllers orbiting miles away in a companion aircraft. Behind it, three emptier B-17s followed at staggered altitudes of 30,000, 18,000, and 13,000 feet. They flew without hesitation into an environment that would have killed any human crew in minutes. Not one of them carried so much as a single living soul. That single image, a four-engine bomber climbing into an atomic mushroom cloud with nobody aboard, announced something the world had never seen. The technology that made it possible had been born from one of the war's most devastating failures. It had killed the eldest son of one of America's most powerful families. It had been tried against 14 targets and succeeded on 0 occasions. And now, reborn in Pacific nuclear fire, it was about to reshape how nations understood both atomic weapons and unmanned flight for the rest of the century. But to understand how the flying fortress became a nuclear ghost, you have to go back 2 years to the skies over England, to a summer evening in August of 1944, when a young Navy lieutenant climbed into an aircraft packed with 10 tons of high explosives and spoke 2 words into his radio that became the last words he would ever say. By the summer of 1944, Allied bombers were hammering Germany around the clock. The 8th Air Force flew daylight precision raids from England, while the Royal Air Force Bomber Command struck by night. Together, they were tearing the industrial heart out of the Third Reich. But certain targets refused to die. The Germans had built enormous reinforced concrete bunkers along the French coast to shelter their most terrifying vengeance weapons. At Siricourt in the Pas-de-Calais, they had constructed launch ramps for the V-1 flying bomb, the pulse-jet-powered cruise missile that was already terrorizing London with random strikes against civilian neighborhoods. At Watton, they had built the Blockhaus d'Epelec, a massive concrete shelter for V-2 ballistic rockets. At Wizernes-la Coupole, a domed concrete bunker sunk into a chalk quarry, was designed to store and fuel V-2s for launch against southern England. And at Mimoyekes, the most frightening installation of all, the Germans were building the Hochdruckpumpe 5 3 supergun. This was a battery of fixed, smooth-bore artillery tubes, each over 400 feet long, embedded deep in concrete and limestone beneath the cliffs of the Pas-de-Calais. The V-3 was aimed directly at London, 100 miles across the Channel. If it became operational, it could fire a continuous barrage of shells into the British capital with no warning and no defence. Each of these bunkers was protected by walls and roofs of reinforced concrete, so massive that no bomb in the Allied arsenal could crack them. The Royal Air Force had tried with Tallboy, its 12,000-pound deep penetration bomb. The Americans had tried with repeated conventional raids, dropping hundreds of tons of general-purpose ordnance. The concrete absorbed the punishment and stood undamaged. Thousands of tons of Allied bombs had been expended with negligible effect. In the fall of 1943, General Henry Arnold, the commanding general of the United States Army Air Forces, ordered Brigadier General Grandison Gardner's team of electronic engineers at Eglin Field, Florida, to try something nobody had ever attempted at this scale. Take war-weary B-17s, aircraft that had flown too many combat missions to remain reliable, with cracked wing spars and worn engines and patched flak holes. Strip them of every ounce of unnecessary weight. Pack them with high explosive from the nose to the tail, and fly them by radio control directly into these concrete bunkers at full speed. The aircraft itself would become the warhead. The kinetic energy of a 4-engine bomber slamming into a target at over 200 miles per hour, combined with 10 tons of high explosive detonating on impact, would deliver destructive force that no conventional bomb could match. The concept was called Operation Aphrodite. General Jimmy Doolittle, commander of the 8th Air Force, formally approved the plan on June 26, 1944. The Army Air Forces assigned the 562nd Bombardment Squadron at RAF Fursfield in Norfolk to prepare and fly the drones, which received the designation BQ-7. The Navy ran a parallel effort called Project Anvil, using converted consolidated PB-4Y, one Liberators designated BQ-8. Project Anvil was operated by Special Air Unit 1 under Commander James Smith. The conversion was brutally thorough. Each B-17 was stripped of roughly 12,000 pounds of material. Armor plate came out. Gun turrets were unbolted and removed. Machine guns, bomb racks, the standard radio transceiver, and most of the seating were all pulled. The escape hatches were enlarged so the 2-man volunteer crew could bail out faster when the moment came. On many airframes, the cockpit canopy was removed entirely to give the pilot an unobstructed path out of the aircraft. In place of all this removed equipment went Torpex. This was a British torpedo explosive, 50% more powerful than TNT alone. The explosive was packed in 55-pound boxes. Roughly 210 boxes were crammed into the bomb bay. 100 more were stacked in the radio room behind the cockpit, and 25 boxes were placed directly behind the pilot's seat. A fully loaded Aphrodite drone carried between 18,000 and 22,000 pounds of high explosive. That was more than twice the normal bomb load of a combat B-17. The pilot and his autopilot engineer were essentially sitting on top of a bomb large enough to demolish a small town. 2 television cameras were installed inside the aircraft. One was trained on the instrument panel, so controllers in the mothership could monitor airspeed, altitude, heading, and engine readings. The second camera pointed forward through the nose glazing to provide a crude view of what lay ahead. The Azon radio guidance system, originally designed as a steerable tail kit for conventional bombs, was adapted to control the drone's flight surfaces. 2 complete Azon sets were installed to give both pitch and yaw authority. A precision radio altimeter was wired into the C-1 autopilot, so the drone could be commanded to fly specific altitudes. A whip aerial on the nose received commands from the mothership. A transmitter antenna in the tail gunner's former position sent the television picture back. The drone could also dispense a smoke trail on command so the mothership could track it visually at long range. All control equipment was wrapped in primer cord that would self-destruct the system on impact, preventing any of this classified technology from falling into German hands. Here was the critical flaw that would define the program's fate. The technology of 1944 simply could not manage an unmanned takeoff. The radio control systems were not precise enough to taxi a 4-engine bomber down a runway, rotate at the correct speed, and climb away safely without human input. Every Aphrodite drone therefore required 2 human volunteers. A pilot and an autopilot engineer would climb aboard the explosive-laden bomber, physically fly it off the ground, establish it in stable flight at 2,000 feet, engage the autopilot, arm the warhead, hand control to the mothership circling above, and then parachute out over English soil before the drone crossed the channel toward occupied France. 8 P-47. Thunderbolts escorted each mission. A de Havilland Mosquito flew weather reconnaissance ahead. These were not naive men who failed to understand what they were volunteering for. They were sitting inches from enough Torpex to level a city block, in an aircraft whose electrical wiring had been hastily modified by engineers working under extreme wartime pressure. They knew that one stray electrical pulse, one short circuit, one bump of turbulence jarring a loose connection could detonate the entire payload at any moment before they reached the bailout point. Every single takeoff was a calculated gamble with their lives. The first Aphrodite mission flew on August 4, 1944, as part of the 8th Air Force's Mission 515. 4 BQ-7s launched against the bunkers at Eniwetok, Siracourt, Wezenez, and Wotton. The results were catastrophic. One drone's autopilot failed immediately after the crew bailed out, pitching the aircraft into a stall and sending it plunging into the English countryside. Another drone lost control when the first crewman jumped and crashed into a wooded area of England, its torpex fortunately failing to detonate on impact. The remaining 2 drones scored only near misses against their hardened concrete targets. A pilot and a flight engineer were killed on the very first day of operations. The guidance system was simply too crude to hit a specific building from miles away. 8 days later came the catastrophe that would define Operation Aphrodite in public memory forever and alter the political destiny of an American dynasty. On August 12, 1944, United States Navy Lieutenant Joseph Kennedy, Jr. volunteered for a Project Anvil mission. Kennedy was the eldest son of former United States Ambassador Joseph Kennedy, Sr. He was the older brother of a young naval officer named John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who would go on to become the 35th President of the United States. Joseph Jr. had already completed 25 combat missions flying B-4Y-1 patrol bombers over the Bay of Biscay and the English Channel, hunting German submarines and dodging anti-aircraft fire. He was eligible to rotate home. His tour was finished. His war was effectively over. He had nothing left to prove to anyone. Instead, he chose to climb into a BQ-8, a Navy-converted B-4Y-1 Liberator, packed with 21,170 pounds of torpex. His co-pilot was Lieutenant Wilford John Willey, the executive officer of Special Air Unit 1, who had used his seniority to displace Kennedy's usual co-pilot, Ensign James Simpson, and take the seat on the mission. The target was the V-3 supergun complex buried in the chalk cliffs at Eniwetok. Kennedy lifted off from RAF Fursfield at 6 in the evening. The Liberator climbed to 2,000 feet over the Suffolk coast and completed its first remote-controlled turn successfully. The aircraft was responding to commands from the mothership. Kennedy and Willey pulled the safety pin to arm the massive torpex payload. Kennedy pressed his radio transmitter and spoke the agreed-upon code phrase, "Spade flush." Those were the last words anyone ever heard from Joseph Patrick Kennedy, Jr. 2 minutes later, well before the planned bailout point near RAF Manston in Kent, the entire 21,170 pounds of torpex detonated in mid-air over the Blyth estuary near Blythburgh, Suffolk. A crewman aboard the photographic de Havilland Mosquito, trailing the mission at a safe distance, reported that nothing larger than a basketball could have survived the blast. Wreckage rained across a 5-mile radius. 59 buildings in nearby villages sustained damage from the shockwave, though remarkably, there were no civilian casualties on the ground. The 4 Pratt & Whitney engines of the Liberator were the only recognizable pieces ever recovered from the debris field. Everything else, the aircraft, its systems, its payload, and both men, had been annihilated in an instant. The cause was never officially determined. Investigators focused their suspicion on inadequate electrical shielding of one of the television cameras. They theorized that stray radio frequency emissions from the camera had induced a current in the arming circuit wiring, tripping a relay solenoid and detonating the torpex before the crew could bail out. An electronics officer named Earl Olson had specifically warned Kennedy the day before the mission that the television wiring harness contained a design defect capable of causing exactly this kind of catastrophic failure. Kennedy had acknowledged the warning and chosen to fly anyway. Both Kennedy and Willey were posthumously awarded the Navy Cross, the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal, and the Purple Heart. Their names are inscribed on the tablets of the missing at the Cambridge American Cemetery in England. The destroyer USS Joseph P. Kennedy, Jr. was launched in his honor in July of 1945. The Navy immediately suspended all further Project Anvil flights. Aphrodite staggered forward without the Navy's participation. Over 14 total missions through January of 1945, targeting U-boat pens on the island of Heligoland, the Hemmingstedt oil refinery, the Hereford marshalling yard, and the Oldenburg power station. Not a single drone successfully destroyed its intended target. Not one. On January 27, 1945, General Carl Spaatz, commander of United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, sent his famous cable to General Doolittle. Aphrodite babies must not be launched against the enemy until further orders. The program was formally terminated on April the 27th, 1945, just days before the war in Europe ended. 14 missions, 0 targets destroyed, multiple crewmen killed, millions of dollars invested. By every conventional military measure, Operation Aphrodite was a complete and total failure. And here is where the story takes the turn that nobody in 1944 could have predicted. Because the technology that failed against German concrete was about to succeed against something far more dangerous, something invisible, something lethal at the molecular level, something that no human pilot, no matter how skilled or brave, could confront and survive. The war ended with a staggering surplus of B-17s. American factories had produced 12,731 flying fortresses between 1937 and May of 1945. Boeing in Seattle, Douglas Aircraft in Long Beach, and Vega Aircraft Corporation in Burbank had maintained production rates that seemed impossible before the war. At peak inventory in August of 1944, the Army Air Forces held 4,574 B-17s worldwide, equipping 32 overseas combat groups. The type dropped more bombs in the European theatre than any other American aircraft. The human cost of flying the fortress had been immense. Roughly 4,735 B-17s were lost during the war to combat and operational accidents. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg double strike on August 17, 1943, cost 60 fortresses out of 376 dispatched in a single afternoon. Black Thursday, the second Schweinfurt raid on October the 14th of that same year, was even worse. 291 B-17s were sent against the German ball-bearing factories. 60 were shot down over Germany. 17 more were so badly damaged that they either crashed attempting to land back in England or were written off on the ground as beyond repair. Another 121 required substantial repairs. Of roughly 2,900 aircrew who flew that mission, approximately 650 did not return. The 8th Air Force temporarily lost air superiority over Germany that afternoon. 17 B-17 crew members received the Medal of Honor during the war. The fortress was the subject of the legendary wartime documentary The Memphis Belle and the post-war classic 12 O'Clock High. It was beloved by its crews to a degree that few military machines in history have ever achieved. The B-17 was not merely a bomber. It was a symbol of American strategic air power and the extraordinary courage of the young men who flew it through the deadliest skies in history. Then Japan surrendered and the symbol became surplus overnight. The B-29 Superfortress was already replacing the B-17 in the active bomber inventory. Thousands of B-17s from dozens of bomb groups were flown across the country to the Arizona desert and parked in neat rows under the sun. The vast majority were subsequently sold for scrap at disposal depots like Kingman Army Airfield and Walnut Ridge, melted down for their aluminum content at a few cents per pound. Of more than 12,000 fortresses built, only a tiny fraction would escape the scrapper's blade. But here was the pivot that would change everything. Precisely because there were so many surplus fortresses, precisely because they were free and abundant, and nobody in the post-war Air Force needed them as bombers anymore, they became the perfect candidate for a mission that the nation desperately needed to accomplish, and that no human crew could possibly perform. America had detonated 3 nuclear weapons: Trinity in the New Mexico desert, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. The nation was about to test many more as the nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union accelerated, and the scientists at Los Alamos, the engineers at the Naval Radiological Defense Laboratory in San Francisco, the strategists at the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the newly created Atomic Energy Commission all needed answers to the same critical set of questions. What actually happens inside a nuclear mushroom cloud in the minutes after detonation? What radioactive isotopes does it contain? In what concentrations and ratios? At what particle sizes? How does the fallout disperse with wind and altitude? What external radiation dose would an aircraft and its crew receive if they flew through the column? What internal contamination would result from breathing the air inside the cloud? These were not academic questions. They were survival questions. The answers would determine how America designed its next generation of nuclear weapons, how it planned civil defense against a Soviet attack, and how close its own Strategic Air Command bomber crews could safely fly to the detonation point of their own bombs. The problem was that a nuclear mushroom cloud minutes after detonation is one of the most lethal environments on Earth. It is a churning column of intensely radioactive fission products. Short-lived isotopes of iodine-131, cesium-137, strontium-90, barium, and lanthanide elements mixed with vaporized bomb casing, superheated debris, and in the case of a surface or underwater burst, irradiated soil or seawater. Any human pilot flying through that environment would absorb a potentially fatal external gamma radiation dose within minutes. Inhaled radioactive particles would lodge permanently in the lungs, in the bones, in the thyroid gland, causing damage that was essentially impossible to reverse. The only way to get the scientific data was to send an aircraft directly into the heart of the mushroom cloud, keep it there long enough to collect meaningful air samples and radiation measurements, and bring it back intact to a runway where the contaminated instruments could be extracted for laboratory analysis. No human being could survive that flight. But here was what Aphrodite's failure had quietly made possible. The same Eglin field engineers who had struggled with crude radio control systems in 1944 had learned from every malfunction, every crashed drone and every design flaw that had killed pilots over England. They understood the B-17 airframe intimately. They knew exactly where the Azon system broke down. They knew what the television link could and could not do. They had spent nearly 2 years after the war's end refining every component, and they had a free, virtually unlimited supply of expendable airframes sitting in rows in the Arizona desert. Under military nomenclature, the Q prefix designated an aircraft modified as an unmanned drone. The wartime BQ-7 became the post-war QB-17. Director aircraft, the manned motherships that controlled the drones in flight, received the D prefix, becoming DB-17s. In May of 1946, 16 B-17s were pulled from desert storage for drone conversion and 6 more became director aircraft. The San Antonio Air Depot at Kelly Field, Texas, performed most of the modification work, and here is where the engineers achieved what Aphrodite never could. They perfected fully unmanned takeoff, en route flight, and landing for a 4-engine bomber. No human aboard at any point during the entire mission. William Shercliffe, the scientific historian who authored the official Crossroads report called Bombs at Bikini, later wrote that many experts had thought it could never be accomplished with planes of this size. Crossroads was the first operation in which takeoff, flight, and landing were accomplished with no one aboard. The feat was an impressive one. The control architecture was a layered system of remarkable elegance. Ground controllers sitting in specially modified jeeps positioned at each end of the runway would taxi, align, and launch the unmanned bomber entirely by radio command. Once the drone was safely airborne, control was handed off to a beat pilot in the accompanying DB-17 director aircraft. The beat pilot sat before a hooded television screen mounted in the director's nose section, watching the live picture transmitted from a camera in the drone's cockpit. He flew the drone through its entire mission profile using switches and an oversized toggle for flight inputs. When the drone approached its destination airfield, control was handed back to the ground jeep controllers for final approach, touchdown, and taxi to the parking revetment. For the nuclear sampling missions, each drone was stripped of all defensive armament and fitted with a specialized scientific payload. A large air sampling filter assembly was mounted in the upper turret position, where the dorsal gun turret had once been. The filter papers were exposed to the slipstream to capture radioactive aerosols and particulate fission products as the drone flew through the cloud. 2 collection bag pods were installed in the bomb bay, designed to fill with contaminated air through forward-facing scoops during cloud penetration, and then to be released over a shielded recovery container on the ground by remote winch. Automatic 16mm and 35mm cameras were set to fire by timers or by ground command. Geiger counters and ionization chambers measured radiation intensity. Pressure transducers and accelerometers recorded blast wave dynamics. Film badge dosimeters were taped at precisely measured intervals across the external surfaces of the airframe to map radiation dose rates at different positions within the cloud. Operation Crossroads was the proving ground. Vice Admiral William Blandy commanded Joint Army-Navy Task Force 1 at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. The stated purpose was to determine the effect of nuclear weapons on naval vessels. 95 warships were anchored in the lagoon as targets, including American battleships Nevada, Arkansas, Pennsylvania, and New York. The aircraft carrier Saratoga was positioned among the target fleet, as was the captured Japanese battleship Nagato, the warship from which Admiral Yamamoto had issued the orders that launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. The scale of the operation was extraordinary: 42,000 men, 242 support ships, 156 aircraft, 750 cameras including high-speed units shooting at 1,000 frames per second, 25,000 radiation recording devices, 5,000 pressure gauges, 4 television transmitters. Bikini cameras would ultimately record 50,000 still photographs and 1.5 million feet of motion picture film. It was the most elaborately instrumented military test in history. 8 B-17 drones deployed to Eniwetok alongside B-17 Director aircraft for the sampling mission. The drones operated from Eniwetok Airfield, roughly 200 miles west of Bikini. The 509th Composite Group, the same unit based at Roswell, New Mexico, that had dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, provided the B-29 that delivered the test weapon. The drones bore the 509th's distinctive mushroom cloud emblem on their fuselages. The Navy contributed a fleet of Grumman F-6F-5 Hellcat drone fighters operated from the carrier Shangri-La and based ashore on Roy Island at Kwajalein Atoll. Each Hellcat's tail fin was painted a different color to identify its individual radio control frequency. Shot Able detonated on July 1, 1946 at 9 in the morning local time. Dave's Dream released the 23-kiloton Fat Man-type plutonium bomb. It exploded 520 feet above the lagoon. Although the bomb missed its intended aim point, the bright orange-painted battleship Nevada, by approximately 1,500 to 2,300 feet, the blast was devastating. The mushroom cloud rose past 35,000 feet. The shockwave flattened ships' upper works and ignited fuel stores across the target fleet. 5 ships sank or were eventually scuttled from the damage. 8 minutes after detonation, the first B-17 entered the cloud at 24,000 feet, its cockpit camera transmitting to the beat pilot in the orbiting B-17 Director. The television picture showed nothing but swirling grey and white as the unmanned bomber plunged into the column. The beat pilot held course by instruments alone, watching the drone's altimeter and heading readouts on his hooded screen, while the aircraft around him was enveloped in a maelstrom of superheated radioactive particulate. 3 more B-17 drones penetrated at 30,000, 18,000 and 13,000 feet, each flying a different altitude band to map the vertical distribution of fission products throughout the cloud. 3 Navy F-6F-5 Hellcat drones from Shangri-La made their own transits at 20,000, 15,000 and 10,000 feet. The Director aircraft and forward photographic planes held station at the cloud's periphery, their crews watching the unmanned machines disappear into the column and waiting to see if they would emerge on the other side. One of the Hellcat controllers, Lieutenant Commander K, later described how the cloud kept right behind him, billowing outward, until he finally managed to pull away. A Hellcat that emerged from the column at 15,000 feet was coated in a thick layer of ice and frost, appearing completely white instead of its normal signal red paint. The ice had formed when moisture in the superheated air of the cloud condensed instantly on the cold aluminum skin of the aircraft as it transited the boundary layer. After the sampling runs, ground controllers in jeeps at Eniwetok guided the drones back to the runway. No manned aircraft was permitted to fly over the blast center for 4 hours after detonation. The recovery procedures on the ground were as carefully scripted as the flight itself. Each returning drone taxied to a remote parking pad upwind of inhabited areas. Ground crews approached using long-handled tools, cable-rigged carts, and remote forklifts. The contaminated filter assemblies and bomb bay sample bags were transferred into lead-lined containers using an ingenious cable and pulley arrangement visible in surviving newsreel footage. The rig kept human handlers at maximum distance from the radioactive cargo at all times. Each man wore a film-badged dosimeter. The sealed containers were loaded onto waiting C-54 transports for shipment to the laboratory at Kwajalein for chemical analysis. Most drones returned intact. 1 B-17 overshot the Eniwetok runway on landing but suffered only minor damage and was reusable. Shot Baker followed on July 25, 1946. This was the underwater detonation. The 23-kiloton bomb was suspended 90 feet below a landing ship in the center of the lagoon. The resulting explosion produced one of the most iconic photographs of the 20th century. a massive column of water and spray rising thousands of feet into the air, with target warships visible as dark silhouettes against the churning white wall of the base surge. The battleship Arkansas, anchored closest to the detonation point, capsized and sank almost instantly as the blast wave tore open her hull plating along the starboard side. A 900-foot-wide base surge of intensely radioactive seawater rolled outward in every direction, coating and permanently contaminating every target ship in the fleet. Nobel laureate chemist Glenn Seaborg, who would later serve as the longest-serving chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, looking back years afterward, described Baker as the world's first nuclear disaster. The B-17 drones flew again, this time through the steam and spray column that hung over the lagoon. One drone that passed directly over ground zero at the moment of detonation had its braking system damaged by the shockwave and overran the runway at Eniwetok on landing. But it suffered only minor structural damage and was reusable. The drones and their contaminated cargo were recovered using the same remote handling procedures. The surviving aircraft were eventually flown back to Roswell Army Airfield in August. The verdict on the drone effort was emphatic. Shercliffe concluded in Bombs at Bikini that the remote-controlled flights had advanced the science of drone plane operations by a year or more. On August 6, 1946, exactly 1 year after Hiroshima, 2 of the Crossroads B-17 drones flew over 2,100 miles entirely unmanned from Hawaii to California, setting a new world record for the longest pilotless flight in history. Journalist Hanson Baldwin wrote in the New York Times that the drone was a portent of push-button war. The success at Crossroads was not a one-off demonstration. It was a foundation that the program built upon rapidly. On January 13, 1947, the first experimental guided missiles group at Eglin flew a B-17 drone from Florida to Washington on a simulated bombing run, making nationwide front-page news. The flight demonstrated that the unmanned fortress could navigate complex waypoints over populated territory, hold precise altitudes, and respond to commands across hundreds of miles of distance between the director and drone. It was a public proof of concept that silenced skeptics who had dismissed Crossroads as a one-time stunt. For Operation Sandstone at Eniwetok Atoll in the spring of 1948, 8 B-17 drones sampled 3 nuclear detonations. Sandstone was the first nuclear test series conducted under the authority of the newly created Atomic Energy Commission rather than the military, and the stakes for the drone program were higher than they had been at Bikini. The 3 shots were proof tests of new levitated core weapon designs, a breakthrough in implosion physics that promised to extract more energy from less fissile material. Shot X-ray on April 15th yielded 37 kilotons. Shot Yoke on May 1st yielded 49 kilotons, more than double the yield of either Crossroads weapon. Shot Zebra on May 15th yielded 18 kilotons. The cloud sampling data from the B-17 drones was essential to confirming how much plutonium had actually undergone fission in each new design, a measurement that could only be obtained by analyzing the isotopic ratios in the captured filter papers. A specialized drone unit designated Task Unit 742, drawn from the Experimental Guided Missiles Group and numbering roughly 460 men, operated the drones and handled the hazardous recovery of contaminated sampling equipment. Official Defense Nuclear Agency photographs from Sandstone show ground crews at Eniwetok using a truck-mounted forklift with an extended arm to grasp the top sampler box from a returned drone, the same remote handling philosophy pioneered at Crossroads, but now refined into standard operating procedure. The work exacted a human cost even at one remove from the mushroom cloud. After Sandstone's Yoke and Zebra shots, several Los Alamos technicians who had been stripping filter papers from the returned B-17 drones developed beta radiation burns on their hands, severe enough to require hospitalization at Tripler Army Hospital in Honolulu. The injuries came not from the drone's external surfaces, but from direct sustained handling of the intensely radioactive fission product residue that had been captured on the filter media. One technician hospitalized after the Yoke shot was still undergoing treatment when another group arrived with identical handburns after Zebra just 2 weeks later. The institutional momentum grew steadily. In 1949, the 550th Guided Missiles Wing was activated at Eglin to expand drone operations. The 2nd Guided Missiles Squadron, which operated the B-17 and DB-17 fleet, logged over 3,000 flight hours without a single mishap that year. The unit won the safety pennant for B-17 type aircraft for the fourth consecutive year. By the late 1940s, drone-flying fortress operations had become routine and statistically safe. The B-17s went on to Operation Greenhouse in the spring of 1951, sampling clouds from 4 nuclear detonations at Eniwetok: Shot Dog, Shot Easy, Shot George, and Shot Item. Surviving photographs from the National Archives show airmen wearing dosimeters hurriedly extracting filter papers from radioactive B-17 drones on the ramp at Eniwetok, working under strict time limits to minimize their personal radiation exposure. The same planes of fame, B-17G, now on display at the Air Museum in Chino, California, served as a DB-17G Director aircraft during Greenhouse and would go on to control the very last operational B-17 sortie in United States Air Force history. The scientific data that these ghost fortresses collected across nearly a decade of nuclear testing shaped the Cold War in ways that remain difficult to overstate. Isotopic ratios recovered from the filter papers allowed scientists to calculate with precision how much fissile material had actually undergone fission in each weapon, a critical measurement for weapons design. Particle size distributions and fallout dispersal patterns informed the civil defense planning models that governments used for decades. Blast wave measurements captured by the drone's accelerometers and pressure transducers told Strategic Air Command exactly how close its own bomber crews could safely fly to the detonation point of their own nuclear weapons, a question with life-or-death implications for every crew in the command. And decades later, the baseline measurements from Crossroads, Sandstone and Greenhouse provided the reference data that the Department of Energy and the Defense Threat Reduction Agency used to identify and verify Soviet, Chinese, French and British nuclear tests detected by American monitoring systems around the world. By Operations Upshot Knothole in the spring of 1953 and Teapot in the spring of 1955 at the Nevada test site, the propeller-driven B-17s were being supplemented and gradually replaced by jet-powered Lockheed F-80 Shooting Star drones for cloud penetration. The jets could reach the cloud faster and could operate at altitudes the aging fortresses could no longer reliably reach. The 3205th Drone Squadron relocated from Eglin Field in Florida to Indian Springs Auxiliary Airfield in Nevada. That installation is the same one that operates today as Creech Air Force Base, the headquarters and operational hub of America's MQ-9 Reaper unmanned aerial vehicle fleet. As the jet-powered F-80 drones assumed the cloud sampling mission in the mid-1950s, the surviving B-17s found a second career that completed their strange transformation from warbird to expendable test subject. They became aerial targets, repainted in brilliant fluorescent red-orange day glow with bold black diagonal stripes for maximum visibility against the sky, carrying O-prefix serial numbers that officially marked them as obsolete. The surviving fortresses were redesignated B-17L and B-17N target drones. They became the principal aerial targets for the first generation of American guided missiles. The Army's MIM-3 Nike Ajax surface-to-air missile tracked and intercepted them over the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. The Hughes AIM-4 Falcon, the world's first operational guided air-to-air missile, was tested against them repeatedly. The 3,225th Drone Squadron at Holloman Air Force Base supported tests over White Sands. The 3,235th Drone Squadron at Patrick Air Force Base in Florida supported additional missile tests along the Atlantic Range. Because surplus fortresses were a finite and dwindling resource, no longer being manufactured by any factory on Earth, controllers actually preferred deliberate near misses to direct hits. The goal was to extract the maximum possible number of test flights from each aging airframe before the inevitable kill shot finally came. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the predecessor of NASA, used remote-controlled B-17s for ditching tests, deliberately crashing the unmanned bombers into the water at measured speeds to study the structural loads on an airframe striking the surface. The Air Force used B-17 drones for live firebombing effects experiments. Each surviving fortress was a finite, irreplaceable resource being consumed one sortie at a time, one missile test at a time, one deliberate crash at a time. By 1958, The Air Force acknowledged that the B-17P Director aircraft were wearing out after over a decade of continuous service, and the supply of available B-17 drones had dwindled to a handful. Replacement parts for an aircraft that had stopped production in 1945 were simply unobtainable. Maintenance costs were climbing steeply with every passing year. The last operational B-17 was destroyed by a guided missile in 1960. The final flying B-17 in United States Air Force service, a B-17P Director aircraft bearing serial number 44-83684, was flown into storage at the Aircraft Disposition Facility at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, Arizona, in August of 1959. The very last operational B-17 sortie in history took place on August 6, 1959, 14 years to the day after the bombing of Hiroshima. On that final flight, the B-17P, now preserved at the Planes of Fame Air Museum in Chino, California, controlled a B-17 drone to its destruction over the test range. It was the final act of an aircraft type that had defined American strategic air power for an entire generation. A handful of the post-war drones and directors escaped destruction. The commemorative Air Force's polished B-17G, known as Sentimental Journey, a Douglas-built aircraft delivered in March of 1945 and never flown in combat, served as a B-17P Director with the 3,215th Drone Squadron during Operation Greenhouse. It flies today as one of the most active restored flying fortresses in the world. The Planes of Fame aircraft that controlled the final B-17 mission in 1959 owes its survival to the same post-war conversion that gave it a decade of quiet service. After the war it was built for had already ended. The question that remains is not whether the program worked. It exceeded every expectation placed upon it. The question is what it reveals about how breakthrough technology actually comes into being. Joseph Kennedy Jr.'s death over the Blythe Estuary on August 12, 1944, was not merely a family tragedy. It was the moment that forced the Army Air Forces to confront the fundamental inadequacy of its unmanned aircraft technology. The television wiring that killed Kennedy became the specific problem that Eglin's engineers tore apart and rebuilt from scratch. The unreliable Azon control link that had crashed drones into English fields became the system they refined until it could land a 65,000-pound bomber on a coral airstrip by remote control from a jeep. The inability to achieve unmanned takeoff, the weakness that required human pilots to ride explosive-laden aircraft into the sky, became the engineering challenge they solved completely by the spring of 1946. They did not succeed despite the earlier catastrophe. They succeeded because of it. Every malfunction documented, every circuit redesigned, every protocol rewritten. Kennedy's death changed more than aviation. He had been groomed by his father to carry the family's political ambitions. His loss over the English countryside that August evening opened the path that eventually led his younger brother John to the presidency. A failed drone program reshaped both military technology and American political history in a single afternoon. The lineage running forward from the B-17 is equally significant, but carries a different character entirely. Where Aphrodite was desperate improvisation under wartime pressure, the post-war drone program matured into a disciplined engineering enterprise that produced genuine institutional knowledge. The QF-80 Shooting Star drone inherited the mission profile and the beep pilot control architecture developed for the Fortress. The QF-86 Sabre and QF-100 Super Sabre followed, each generation carrying the operational doctrine of its predecessor forward into faster airframes at higher altitudes. The four foundational drone ranges that supported these aircraft, Eglin in Florida, Holloman in New Mexico, Point Mugu in California, and Indian Springs in Nevada, remain pillars of America's unmanned aircraft infrastructure to this day. The same Indian Springs runway where the 3,205th Drone Squadron's propeller-driven B-17s once landed underground jeep control is today the hub from which MQ-9 Reapers are operated by satellite link over distant continents. It is one of the few genuinely unbroken technological threads in the history of military aviation. From wooden radio control boxes in a wartime hangar to encrypted satellite uplinks in the Nevada desert, the operating concept has never changed. A human controller, separated from the aircraft by distance and by danger, flies a machine into an environment where sending a pilot would be unacceptable. The tools evolved. the principle did not. Of the more than 12,000 flying fortresses that rolled off American assembly lines during the greatest industrial mobilization in human history, fewer than 50 complete airframes survive anywhere in the world today, and only a handful of those can still fly. A disproportionate number of the survivors owe their existence to the drone program. They were late production aircraft, born too late for the war they were built to fight, delivered straight from the factory into desert storage. Their engines never turned in anger over Europe. Their gun turrets never tracked a German fighter. They went from storage to drone conversion to a decade of quiet service in the Pacific and Nevada test ranges. And when the program finally ended, a few were released to civilian operators instead of being scrapped. The war that consumed their older sisters is the reason they were built. The drone program that consumed their youth is the reason they survive. There is a straight line from Spade Flush, spoken over the Suffolk coast on a summer evening in 1944, to the autonomous flight systems guiding unmanned aircraft above distant battlefields today. That line passes through the radioactive clouds over Bikini and Eniwetok, through the dayglow-painted targets spiraling earthward over white sands, through the last B-17P taxiing into quiet storage at Davis Monthan on an August afternoon in 1959. The Flying Fortress was built to carry 10 brave men into the most dangerous skies in history. It became the machine that proved men did not need to fly at all. And in proving that, a handful of engineers working from a jeep on a coral airfield in the summer of 1946 opened a door that the world has never been able to close. The fortress found its final purpose not by carrying men to war, but by flying where no man could follow.